Good morning and welcome to the Daily Aus. It is Thursday, the 16th of April. I'm Sam Koslowski.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
There's a word that economists really hate saying out loud. The IMF just handed the world 3 possible futures: weaker, worse, and severe. And in the worst case, it says we're on the brink of that word. A war in the Middle East, oil at $100 a barrel, and the sharpest global warning in years. On today's podcast, we're going to ask one of Australia's sharpest economic minds, the economist from the Australia Institute, Greg Jericho, on whether it's time to actually start saying the word recession out loud.
Sam, I'm really excited to get into this chat.
Yeah.
I feel that we have been talking about or whispering about and speculating about the recession, the potential for it for some time. So I can't wait to hear Greg's thoughts. We're going to bring you that chat in just a moment. But first, you're going to hear from TDA team member Sarah.
My name is Sarah. I am the Strategic Partnerships Manager at the Daily Aus. One of the most common questions we get asked at TDA is, how do we make money? I love that question because it's exactly what I do, help TDA make money. We mainly do that via ads on newsletters, Instagram, and podcast episodes. When I started, our commercial team had just 2 people. Now we have 7. To keep growing our team, which in turn means we can keep explaining the news to you, we need our audience to grow. The best way you can help us is by pressing follow on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. And thank you for being part of the TDA community.
Greg Jericho, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. It's great to be here.
So Greg, you've tracked the Aussie economy data very closely for years. You wrote in The Guardian this week, was it this week, that you've noticed last week, that you've noticed economists being asked to predict if there's going to be a global recession and when that will be. I believe you said something like, economists have predicted 30 of the last 5 recessions, which I loved. I'm not going to ask you that because we don't actually know. And no matter how expert Greg Jericho you can be, you don't know either. But what I do want to ask you is, when you get to your desk in the morning, what specific indicators are you looking at to try and figure out the answer to that?
Yeah, well, generally, unfortunately, you don't even have to look at any data or anything. You're looking at what did Donald Trump post overnight. Unfortunately, that's the biggest indicator right now of whether or not things are going to be good, because it's all relying on the Strait of Hormuz opening up, the Iran war ending, and things hopefully getting back to some sort of normality. But this is, as you point out, where it gets tricky for economists, because we're having to deal with the variable of Donald Trump. So it's sort of looking at that, but really in terms of what I'm going to really care about sort of as we go on across this year is really just looking at unemployment, what's happening there, because that's always the first indicator. When things start going bad, unemployment starts rising. And
so are you confident in saying, actually, this isn't an economic crisis?
Oh, it's definitely a crisis, definitely an economic crisis, but whether or not it turns into a recession, that is not something I think we should just assume this is what's going to happen.
Right.
I think there is a bit of when there was an oil crisis back in the 70s, there were recessions. And yes, there were terrible recessions, especially in the early 80s. But we need to remember a lot of that was because things were greatly different back then. There was really strong centralized wage fixing. And so there was a real link between inflation going up and then wages just jumping up, because also there was a strong unionized labor force. We don't have that now. It's very separate. Just because prices go up doesn't mean our wages go up, as we all know from the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And also back then, inflation was already a lot higher. In the 70s, inflation was a lot higher than it was now. And so central banks really went overboard trying to kill inflation. And, back then, for example, in the 1979, 1980s, the Reserve Bank took the cash rate up to over 20%. Now, that's not going to happen this time round. Yeah. So it doesn't mean we're going to have recession, but it just means the risks are a lot higher than they perhaps were back in January and early February.
So let me just double check my notes here. So you're saying that a unionized workforce means that wages are set by kind of a central body. We don't have as much of that as we did in the 70s. And we also don't have the rapid rate of inflation that was happening anyway. So when you have then the cost of goods and services rising because of the closure of a major waterway, then the absence of those two things means that we're more open to inflation being felt more across the economy. Have I kind of distilled that?
Yeah, what generally I'm saying is that as we've got a really good example from 22-23 where the Russia invasion of Ukraine set off inflation.
Interesting.
And what we saw was inflation rise, but we didn't see a big jump in wages. We saw there was no wage price spiral. In fact, what we really saw was companies taking advantage of it and raising prices to fatten their profits. We didn't see wages suddenly explode. And that means that generally inflation is a bit more anchored than it was 40 years ago, back in the 70s and 80s.
So on a base level, the job of the RBA then for the rest of the year is to try and control that inflation number. But isn't that going to happen anyway if the Strait of Hormuz remains shut and the cost of petrol, but also the cost of everything else? I mean, we've had the fertilizer discussion on this podcast. We've had the indirect ways that affects our wallets discussion. Won't that inflation happen anyway? Like, why does the RBA then need to double up on that?
Yeah, you're making an incredibly good point. The Reserve Bank should be worried about inflation in Australia and things that it can affect here. It can't affect world oil prices, world gas prices, world fertilizer prices, all of these things. And in such periods, what central banks should do is what we say, look through the inflation and basically say, look, this has got nothing to do with us. Let's not react as though it's all led by domestic issues. What the Reserve Bank will say is, yeah, that's fine. But if it gets to a point where consumers, businesses, everyone kind of expects inflation to stay high, and like we're talking, say, above 5%, then the Reserve Bank will say, well, the problem is even if that is because of an oil price shock and because of things happening over in the Middle East, businesses and workers are going to say, yeah, that's fine, but I want a 5.5% wage increase.
Right.
And that's when they start saying, okay, now it's flowing into inflation expectations, and we want to keep those anchored to that sort of 2 to 3%.
Right.
The problem with all of this is the biggest correlation of inflation expectations for people is petrol prices, because that is overwhelmingly the one price that everyone knows and is aware of on a daily basis, even more than, say, milk or bread. We kind of like, I don't know, what is the price of bread? I can't remember. But every sort of 200 meters, you're reminded of what the price of petrol is every day as you pass it. So that's where it's going to be a bit tricky. And that's where I'm really worried about the Reserve Bank. Are they going to just say, oh, we've got to really be tough to keep those inflation expectations down? And they keep raising interest rates. And I'm like, yeah, but are we actually out all spending manly? Are we out all thinking that, this is good times and that's why inflation is going up? And you're right. I really worry that the Reserve Bank is kind of going to smash us for something that it doesn't really have much control over.
Is this on? It's Billy from TDA, and we are wondering if you can hit subscribe to help this channel grow. Now, back to the video.
Do you see that sort of tension that the Reserve Bank holds? Do you see that being split along party lines as well? Are you seeing it play out politically as you thought it would?
Not so much politically. I think what we will see is more of a case of the government blaming essentially Donald Trump, although perhaps not mentioning it, but saying that, look, this has got nothing to do with us. This is because of the Middle East. And you'll see the opposition just blaming the government, saying, oh, well, you should have thought ahead. Your policies are causing inflation to go up. You should be doing things. Yeah. And the Reserve Bank perhaps getting off scot-free when really the real risk of a recession is that the Reserve Bank raises interest rates by so much that it, in an effort to notionally reduce inflation, that it just kills the economy, because we're not just getting hit with higher oil prices, higher fertilizer prices that are flowing into food and other things, but we're also getting interest rates going up as well. And that's kind of what we saw in the 1980s, and we had a terrible recession. So I would hope that the Reserve Bank is very scared of that happening, and rather than being sort of cavalier and going, oh, well, but we've got to keep inflation under control. I'm like, I'd prefer 4.5% inflation to a deep recession that takes a decade to get out of.
Right. And I'd say one of the things that are on the desks of those at the RBA and probably every other central bank in the world this week is the latest statement from the IMF. They came out yesterday and said that there are kind of three possible futures: weaker, worse, and severe. What did you think of that framing? I mean, this is, one of the central monetary bodies in the world. It's a pretty dramatic statement.
Yeah, as I say in my column, it's a little bit like Starbucks with their sizes of coffee. There's no sort of small, medium, and large. Everything sounds really big, and in this case, everything sounds terrible.
Yeah,
it was pretty stark, and I found also a little bit humorous, given a couple of months ago, their January update was titled "Steady Amid Divergent Forces." And I was like, steady? You think the global economy is steady? Maybe wait and see. And sure enough, they're not talking about it being steady anymore. The worst thing about the IMF's predictions is actually the weaker situation, or the sort of the current situation. It seems to almost be the least likely, because it's really forecasting that this whole thing gets resolved pretty quickly,
right,
and everything goes back to normal. And instead, sort of the second scenario, the adverse scenario, is one where oil prices stay around $100 a barrel for the rest of the year, because it takes a long time for this crisis to be fixed. And given what we've seen with the US and its negotiations with Iran, and also Israel's seeming attempts to stymie any of them, should it be forcing them to stop bombing Lebanon, what are the likelihood that it's all going to be resolved quickly and everything goes back to normal? It seems to be shrinking with each day, and so that's not good. And even still, if you look at those forecasts, even under the best situation, we're still seeing Australia's GDP downgraded, growth from 2.2 to 2.0% this year, and even worse, sort of next year, they're downgrading it down to 1.7% growth.
Right.
That's pretty slow, and that's teetering on the edge of a recession. And that's why you see the Treasury out really warning that these pretty dim times, shall we say, not good times ahead.
I've got two more questions. Just quickly wanted to touch on rent with you, because a large portion of our audience, me included, we're renters. How do you see, let's say that the Strait remains a conflict zone and this plays out for the next couple of months, how do you see that trickling down to the rental economy?
Well, unfortunately, what we saw on, the last time the Reserve Bank started raising interest rates is that rent prices quickly followed.
Right.
Even though landlords, because of negative gearing, really shouldn't be feeling a need to increase rents off the back of interest rate rises, because an interest rate rise just means they've got more to negative gear. Well, you always see landlords take advantage of this situation and go, oh, well, my interest bill has gone up, so unfortunately your rental bill has to go up as well, which, as I say, is not linked. And even still, even if your landlord, has probably paid off their investment property, they still use it as an excuse to increase rates. So that's a big concern.
Yeah.
Especially because renters not only are having to pay rent, but they, as I say, have to pay everything else.
Yeah.
So they're getting hit by these petrol prices, are getting hit by all the other increases in prices as well. So it is a bit of a double whammy. You could say, even if you own your own home, you are, as I say, also getting hit by that double whammy of higher mortgages.
Sure.
But yeah, I think that's the worry. The good news, though, is even now, even though the market is forecasting interest rates to go up, they're not forecasting them to go up anywhere as fast as they did back in 22, 23.
Right.
They might go up a bit above the peak of where they got, but sort of we're only sort of maybe seeing another 2 rate rises this year, maybe 3 on the sort of the worst case scenario. So nothing like the, 12 in a row or something like that,
Sure.
The madness that we saw back in 22, 23.
So we're not quite at pandemic levels, but it's still some very concerning words being thrown around in the media. I know for a lot of people in this economic realm, the word recession is being used more, I can see, than at any other point in, say, the last 12 months. I want to leave, though, with some good news because we have covered some dark territory. You just mentioned one potentially positive indicator. I'd love to hear something else that you're seeing that perhaps makes you feel a little calmer about Australia's position, a little calmer about the way in which we could all be feeling it individually. There has to be something there, Greg.
Look, I think...
Don't go Starbucks on me.
Look, the budget, the coming budget is going to be a big one because the government is going to have to balance doing what it can to help households and businesses due to a supply shock, which is what government should do, although they shouldn't sort of go overboard. Doing these nice targeted 3-month things are good. There does seem to be a suggestion that they're going to perhaps look at things like capital gains tax and negative gearing and possibly and hopefully a tax on the gas industry, who are just making out like bandits right now, let me tell you. And the good thing about doing that is it gives the government a bit more fiscal buffer to be able to then help us without worrying about, this is going to set fire to the economy because the government is just throwing around a lot of cash.
Right.
It's a case of, yes, they're doing some targeted assistance that's going to help, hopefully, those people who really need the help the most, but do in a way that they're not blowing the budget and are going to scare everyone into thinking, you're just adding fuel to the fire, so to speak. So that's kind of a positive thing. I'm worried about the Reserve Bank. I hope they do at least show some concern about a recession. They very much do at least seem to acknowledge that there is a recession likelihood. My hope is that they get a bit more worried about it than I think they are. But look, the good news is so far unemployment hasn't gone up. The bad news is we're going off of figures from February. We haven't seen any figures yet from after the war. So. Right. At least even the IMF is forecasting unemployment not to get above 4.5%. And if we can achieve that, that's a pretty good outcome because if you can keep your job, that helps you pay the bills even when inflation is rising.
A lot to take in there, but thank you for making it all make a little bit more sense. Greg, thanks so much for joining us.
No problem. It's always great to be here.
As always, such a fascinating chat. Yeah. Sam, you and Greg have a special chemistry.
Bit of an economic bromance, I think.
Yeah, economic bromance. Love that. Thank you so much, Sam, for unpacking all of that for us today. Huge thanks, as always, to Greg Jericho for joining us on the Daily Aus. Now, before we wrap up, Sam, you have some kind of fun piece of information to share with us in case you missed it. We're doing this at the end of our pods now.
I know this tidbit thing is catching on, but I wanted to find one that was economic because we're here, we're talking to Greg. It's a very finance-themed podcast episode.
Love it. Enlighten me.
So we talked about inflation, right?
Yes.
In that conversation. Now I want to tell you about Coachella inflation.
Oh my goodness.
How much do you think a single cup of coffee was at Coachella this year?
Oh my God. 1 cup of coffee.
In Aussie dollars.
In Australian dollars, cup of coffee at Coachella. I'm going to say $13.
$24 cup of coffee.
No.
It was 37 Australian dollars for chicken tenders and chips, which I know you're a big chicken tender fan.
I love my tendies.
And wait, strap yourself in, $57 for a slice of pizza and a Coke Zero.
No.
So that is inflation.
That is horrifying.
I think if we ever get to the Coachella price point, we are in way more trouble than even Greg could predict.
You know what? That makes me feel slightly better about my Coachella FOMO. Obviously, we're heading into weekend 2 of Coachella, so there's going to be all of the amazing performances back on your feeds, all of the influencers, all of the outfits and celebs.
And we'll pay for a $6 cup of coffee here and feel great.
Yeah, I actually feel good about not being there.
Excellent.
Coachella, who needs it?
Exactly.
That is it for today's episode. Keep an eye out tomorrow morning, though. We are doing a deep dive on some interesting history regarding Coachella.
Oh, cool.
Now, if you liked today's chat, don't forget we have a finance newsletter. TDA Finance comes out every Wednesday, straight to your inbox. It's free and easy. We'll pop a link in the show notes if you want to subscribe. We'll be back a little later with your evening news headlines, but until then, have a great day.